Second Nature, Patrick Crawford, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm so fired up because, like I was saying, you and I love to nerd out about the same exact thing. And now we get to do it publicly, which is going to be a really fun conversation because I sort of consider you as like one of the OGs when it comes to athlete content, athlete social. And you're just kind of like this content strategy wizard that I really look up to. So I'm just really excited to kind of dig into sort of your history with Inkwell, Rome, Freeskier, and all the athletes and projects that you've worked on. I think we could take this conversation like 50 different directions, which is going to make it kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good summary of where I am. So, Cadence Media Strategy is my company. I'm working with, a variety of brands, helping them on think through like how are they going to use social, how are they going to use email, web content, and creators really. I think of each of those as like tools in the toolbox. And there's a moment when you want to pull out that tool. It's not just like it's always all about social or it's always all about this. It's sort of like let's sit down and think through what is the goal of each of these things and how do you use them. So that's sort of, and then I can help with the execution too. Like once we get to the end, I'm like, okay, I think we should really run this kind of a program. Then I can slide in and help. So that's a good chunk of my time. I have a newsletter on Substack that I've been writing called Zero Draft, where I'm just sort of trying to think through these things. And, there aren't answers. So it's more of a thinking out loud and getting feedback from people. And then try to take advantage of some freedom and get out on the bike or get out skiing whenever I can. So it's sort of like, every day and every week is pretty different depending on the client stuff. The work gets real busy for 2 weeks and then like slows down a little bit when you're in between like a big project. So, which is pretty nice.
I think the first thing that came across my radar in recent time was the niche versus reach article that you posted. And I think one of the lessons that I'm sort of learning from you is this idea that like it doesn't have to be all on all the time with every single lever. There are the right and wrong times to pull certain levers to achieve the different goals. And I was reading another article that you had written or an interview that you had done where someone was asking you about influencer strategy or something like that. And you're like, well, what is the actual goal? Let's start with that, not just like, do I need this? Yes, no. What is the actual thing that I'm trying to accomplish? And I've got to imagine that sometimes you probably want to bang your head against the computer because you're having to answer that question so many times of the difference between a creator and an influencer or why you need this or why you don't need that. But is there something that you're sort of all in on that you're excited about that is kind of present now that maybe during your Inkwell days didn't exist?
Oh, I'm so motivated right now by looking into how the creator marketplace is growing. You see all these crazy stats, right? Like the study that's been going around of the creator marketplace is going to be $500 billion globally by 2027. I mean, there's variations on this theme, right? But over the last couple of years, the ecosystem and the willingness of companies to spend, advertise, and work with creators and athletes, which are it's like two sides of the same coin, but it's grown so much, and I think there's so much more, particularly like non-endemic support, from the outdoor space, like other brands coming in and willing to work with, interested to work with athletes, and I think the sophistication of how they want to work together has grown. Like when I started Inkwell, which is a creator and content marketing company I founded with two good friends, Chris Gerard and Luke Blazer. And 2013, like the term creator marketing didn't even exist. And we didn't even really like, as we started getting that kind of business, we didn't really know what it was. We were just sort of like, oh, look, here's a brand that wants to work with an athlete that we work with. And we were just trying to figure out how to put it together. And early on, you'd get these offers like, we'll pay you $500 to use a hashtag on Twitter. And that was like the offer. And you were like, what is, like, no, I don't want to do that. Like, what is that? I don't even understand. Even then it was pretty obvious that that wasn't where it was going. But you look at where we are now and all these platforms are growing. YouTube is growing like crazy. The ecosystem that's developing is really going to be robust. And I think it's got a lot of upside.
It feels right now like there's varying levels of sophistication within these discussions with the brands and creators specifically, and there's a lot of stuff where you sort of have to almost manage up a little bit in these conversations of like, hey, I can do this for you, but here's the right way to speak to my audience, or here's how this should work, and here's the best practice that I would recommend if we're going to do a partnership. We do this. But go back to those Inkwell days in 2013 and in the first early days, the level of education you must have had to do to figure this out must have just been astronomical. And this is at a pretty big scale because you're working with clients like Travis Rice, Jimmy Chin, right? Alex Honnold. What was the education like in that era when the idea of the creator economy didn't really exist?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, because it was still so new for all of us, I don't know so much it was about education. It was just we were all figuring it out together. So we were, helping some brands run their social, like run their own social and content strategy, because as we all know, every brand is essentially a media brand, and we all had media backgrounds. I'd helped start Freeskier magazine and been an editor there, along with both of my co-founders and partners at Inkwell. And so we were sort of approaching all this stuff from a media perspective. And then we were also approaching it from the realization that athletes had more reach than most media brands. And so we sort of had these insights like everybody needs to be running a publishing company, and athletes actually have a lot more reach and impact than most media brands. Like somehow there's a business there. Somehow there's like a service that everybody needs in the intersection of those two things. And then you just start trying stuff. And it was probably, a couple of years in before we were really able to effectively sell brands and work with brands on sort of that weren't their full-time sponsor. Where a brand would come in and be like, we actually want to do a program because we're releasing a new product and we want to, find a couple of athletes or creators out there and work with them on this product release. And that was definitely not in 2013. There was several years before like that thing started to become something that brands would experiment with. But even then it was very much like, I want to try it. I want to do a test. And then they would be like, great, check that one off. We've tried that. Like, let's move on to the next thing. And I think now it's more the situation where they're like, okay, this is now a permanent part of our marketing strategy. We're going to do this over and over again, whether it's with the same people over a long period of time, or every quarter we're going to try a different campaign and try different things. It's not like a one-off experiment.
Knowing what you know now after launching Inkwell, running it, continuing to move on afterwards, if you were to relaunch Inkwell now, which is, well over a decade after the original launch, what would Inkwell look like if you're like, okay, here's what it's going to be. We're going to make this athlete social business and we're going to work with both brands and athletes. How would you approach it differently? Because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the initial thing was we're going to basically work with these athletes. We're going to help them with their social media channels, developing content, posting content. And at that era, posting content was actually a big lift because, like you said, they were traveling around to like the Himalayas and didn't have cell service and needed to have sort of a centralized operation. But now, a decade on, what would you be thinking about if you were going to approach the same exact concept, or would you just run the opposite direction?
No, I still think there's a lot of pieces of that are valuable. I think the things that I think of differently now is I want to have a better mix of people who think of themselves as athletes and people who think of themselves as creators. And I don't get too hung up on all these definitions of like athlete and creator and influencer. Like they're at some level they're not that meaningful, but at another level, like a creator is somebody who's like, I'm a one person media entrepreneur at some level, and they may also be really good at climbing or skiing or snowboarding or cycling or whatever their thing is. And that's what they talk about. But those type of people, I think there's just a lot of opportunity in that space. And some athletes are totally there. Some athletes are like, yeah, this is a huge part of my career. And others are like, look, I'm making enough money competing and I just do enough social to get by. And those can be harder to bring into a program with brands, to bring into a marketing program than the ones who are like, I'm essentially a media company. I'm a little one-person media company. And so that's where I'm interested these days in working and trying to figure out like, what does that economy look like in the outdoor and action sports world? Like, who are those people? What channels are they using? Who's following them? I tend to say, like, you referenced this thing that I talked about of niche versus reach. But that's probably even a misnomer. I feel like we need a new term rather than niche media, because some of these things have a huge amount of reach. Like, these
Mhm.
aren't tiny little communities. They're just communities that are organized around one thing.
Yeah.
And it could be like, this is a podcast about whatever, it's gravel racing or snowboarding, whatever. But it's like, it's got a big audience. So it's not really small. It's just that it's like very tight. And I think figuring out how you sort of work in those communities is really interesting.
I think the most difficult part in those situations is trying to explain to someone who's looking for volume why quality is maybe better than quantity. And I think about that a lot with Second Nature, where we have a hyper engaged audience of like basically the Davos panel of the outdoor industry listens to this podcast, which is awesome, and I certainly don't take that for granted. But it's a fraction of who's following me on my mountain bike channel. And if you had to really think about it, the value in the Second Nature audience is probably 10x what, a mountain bike following is to the right partner. And I think maybe that's what it really comes down to, is finding the right people who both value and want to work with that audience. But yeah, the engagement part of it is such a big part of this whole thing.
Totally. And you think about it, like, just the Super Bowl was last weekend, right? So there's the Olympics, there's Super Bowl, like sports things, maybe a little bit Grammys or Oscars, but there aren't that many big media moments where everybody's watching the same thing anymore. I just saw a stat the other day. This is like the average person's using like 6.8 different social platforms a month. So it's like, not only is it the community that this person's into this activity and another person's a fan of something else, they're also using all these different platforms. And I wonder if we'll look back and be like, the anomaly was this 50-year span where there was TV, that everybody just watched the same show on TV from whatever 19 whatever to 2010. And that was what's weird. And the world we're in now, where you have all these interest areas that are really maybe not quite as big, but they're certainly big enough to make a difference. And that's the more norm, because that's probably how it's been over the longer period, rather than this like weird moment where everybody in the whole world watched like the Cosby Show.
Yeah, this idea of monoculture where everybody was watching the same thing. I think I'd referenced this on a previous pod about like Taylor Swift's Eras tour might be the last thing that really broke through, where everybody had at least some working knowledge of what was going on there. I want to go back to this idea too of sort of how things echo, right? Where if you look at the business world, you've got these like big behemoth brands, and then you've got these challenger brands that are coming up quickly to kind of take a big bite out of the market share, and they're, establishing themselves as sort of like up there. And I almost think that in the same way, media is doing the same thing, where we've had these behemoth media brands that have been out there. And now, just because of the way that the internet works and everything else we have access to, social media, et cetera, you can now have sort of challenger media brands as well. And it's not just like a magazine or a website, but it could be a person, a creator in that way. And one of the other things that Steve Holmberg, who helps us out with a lot of the insights that we talk about, he talks about this concept of top of mountain and mid mountain when it comes to brands. So top of mountains, like, and I think brands, but also you could apply the same thing to athletes and creators, right? Where the top of mountain is the aspirational best in the world, something that's sort of not necessarily accessible, but it gets you fired up. Whereas the mid mountain is that super accessible stuff. And I think you might look at it in the same way with athletes and creators, where a lot of athletes are top of the mountain. They're aspirational, they're exciting, but you can't really access them. And the creators are more of like a mid mountain, where they are extremely accessible. You can comment on their YouTube channel or DM them on Instagram or whatever, and probably get some sort of response. It's funny how things kind of echo that way.
It's interesting though. I mean, the top of mountain, mid mountain almost implies a value, that
Mm-hmm.
if you're at the top of the mountain, somehow you're better or higher. And I'm not totally sure if that's quite if that metaphor implies something that maybe isn't there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because you could make an argument pretty easily that that more accessible creator who's reaching just as many people is, in a lot of cases, more valuable.
I wouldn't necessarily, well, we definitely wouldn't say that everybody who's mid mountain is trying to get their way to the top of the mountain. You're not just
Yeah.
climbing in that sense. Like there are people who are like incredible athletes and they're creators who are great creators. And they're like, I'm never going to win a World Cup event, but I'm going to run a really awesome, YouTube show about my sport.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
okay. That doesn't, they don't necessarily have to get to the other level of the mountain.
I think what's so interesting about having things like YouTube existing right now, especially for athletes, is that you can basically have your own TV channel. And I know that's like really simplifying it, but imagine even if you had to put a little bit of money into making it happen by hiring an editor or filmer, imagine owning your own TV channel. And you think about how many people would actually sit and watch a TV show versus how many views you could potentially get on a YouTube video for that level of investment. Like, what would it cost to buy a TV channel? Gosh, I don't even know. But you could essentially get the same exact effect. And not only that, be able to build an ecosystem, a flywheel, a business off of that. Like, there's a really big opportunity out there for athletes or just about anybody who is passionate about a sport and wants to put the time and effort into making their own thing.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the, did, there's a lot of downsides that everyone's talked about of YouTube or Meta or whatever owning the distribution channel, and that's hurt the media, traditional media. Like that was their moat, was nobody could own a TV channel, and so they owned distribution, and you couldn't get there. You had to go through them. But also, like the distribution's so hard. Like taking that off your plate opens up running a little media channel. Even when we were starting Freeskier, like getting a magazine on a newsstand was really hard. And there was like three of us, and we were all like, and then it was five of us or whatever. Like, so how do we like? Where do you find a printer? How do you get a mag? Like, how does the U.S. Postal Service work? And like your competitors that were part of bigger companies are like, I don't know how it works. We just send off a magazine and it just gets printed and ends up on newsstands. And like we were fighting every one of those little battles trying to figure out how that whole system works. And now that sort of goes away for creators who are doing similar things to what we were trying to do way back when we were starting a print magazine. They're just like, yeah, now I just use YouTube or I use Substack and I don't have to worry that much. Like I got to sort of work the algorithm, and there's lots of downsides to that too that we can talk about. But I think that's what helps some of these companies be. You can be nimble and still be effective. I think there's you probably saw that Scott Galloway, who runs a bunch of podcasts, was saying his podcast is doing over $1 million in revenue per employee because he doesn't have to like deal with distribution. So he's only got like 8 or 10 people on the total team, and they're doing like $10 million a year in revenue. Like that's an incredible little media brand.
Yeah, you can be nimble. You can actually do a lot with a little. What do you think is missing though? Like what are those downsides? What are the struggles that people are going to end up running into?
Oh, well, I mean, there's the obvious ones are sort of the audience capture and algorithm capture, in the sense that it becomes really obvious what content works on TikTok or Reels. And then all of a sudden, everybody's kind of doing one of, there's like a few options. Like, this is how long it is, this is the format, and you can kind of be like this or like that. And everyone sort of has to fit into, at least at some level, has to fit into a mold. And that stifles creativity for sure, but it also gets you a ton of discoverability. Like if you fit in that mold and you're good at it, then all of a sudden you could reach 100 million people next week.
Yeah,
Your
yeah,
video could totally pop off. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and I am still trying to figure out where this goes, but I feel like if you look at the content types and you think about how much they're controlled by an algorithm, it's like an inverse correlation, right? So TikTok and Reels, Instagram Reels, are probably as driven by an algorithm as you possibly could be. And at the other end is podcasting,
right.
which basically all the tools suck. They're impossible to find podcasts. And like even podcasts you follow, like I follow Second Nature, it's hard to keep up with what's happening because the tools are so bad.
Hmm.
But everything on Instagram Reels and TikTok is like kind of fits into one of a two, a handful of little formats, and podcasts are all over the place.
Yeah,
Like some are 30 minutes, some are 5 hours, some are about like any topic under you could possibly imagine, some are paid, some are free. They're all over the place. And I think it shows you that it's not that people all want the exact same thing. It's that the algorithm sort of pushes that on us.
There's a great graph that I saw that on one end it had basically the X and Y axis are discoverability and loyalty, right? So on one side of the axis, you've got TikTok, Instagram, super high discoverability, super low loyalty. On the other side of this graph, you've got podcasts, super high loyalty, super low discoverability. And I think YouTube might be somewhere in the middle, but I think that's why you see a lot of podcasts trying to use their Instagram or their TikTok to drive more traffic to it. But the idea of driving followers from one platform to another is hilariously difficult, and I've struggled with that. And that was probably one of the biggest mistakes that I made when I was at Red Bull, was assuming when an athlete would show up and be like, I've got 30,000 followers on Facebook, 30,000 on Instagram, 30,000 on YouTube. I wrongly assumed that those are the same 30,000 people. So their actual audience size was 30,000 people, when in reality, it's probably closer to like 60 or 70,000. And sure, there's some overlap, but it is hilariously difficult to get people to jump from one to the other.
So if you're the brand marketer, then you're at Red Bull. Like, how do you value one channel more than the other, or do you say like I just like how many total people does this person have across all the channels, and can they make a move from one place to the other?
I think there's at that era that I was there, I don't really think that those numbers came into play hardly at all. When we signed Dylan to Red Bull, I remember his social following was under 10,000, but we still signed him to be a Red Bull athlete. It wasn't like that was the final piece. Kate Courtney, a mountain biker, had I think 40,000 followers, which at the time was pretty great for like a junior rider. But now she's at like 550,000. So, you know, everything has taken on a lot more importance. What I'd be thinking about right now is how could we leverage those platforms in a project, and what you see now specifically, and this is why I'm pushing a lot of athletes to pick up YouTube or to pick up some content structure, is that brands are starting to invest in the athletes channels, where if they do a big project, they put that content on the athletes YouTube channel and maybe not on the brand's channel, which is great for the brands that are developing long-term relationships with those athletes, that are developing essentially another marketing lever. But I've had a few athletes that I'm friends with where I'm like, hey, every single time this bike company posts a video of you on their YouTube channel, it gets 200,000 views. Do you know how much money you're not making by doing that, and how much money they are? If they're monetizing it appropriately, like that's probably paying for the production, or, close.
Do you think the brand manager, like if they're investing in growing their audience and growing their athletes and growing their athletes' audiences and followings, do you think that they feel that there's a risk that that athlete's going to then go ride for a competitor's brand, and all of a sudden they've essentially like built the audience for their competitor?
Sure. I mean, that's a risk, but if you're planning to have a long-term relationship with an athlete, then, ideally you're going to keep them around for a long time. And even if they end up at another brand years down the line, you're still going to get the benefit of, that's the other good thing about all this content, is even if they switch to another brand, it's not like they're going to private all your content. Your stuff is still going to be on the internet getting views. I mean, I've got videos on the Super Rider channel that are 2 or 3 years old that are still getting 500 to 1,000 views a day. So it's still relevant. It still gets value. It still gets views. And I think the longer you're with somebody, the more value you get out of it too. People start to really associate that athlete with the brand. You think about Red Bull specifically, those athletes on average are with the brand for a decade. It's part of their identity to be a Red Bull athlete, and their fans and community associate them with, so that, in the event that they are no longer a Red Bull athlete, it's sort of disorienting to see them without the helmet or the hat.
I've been looking a lot at brands and how they're using creator content
Mhm.
or athlete content, same kind of thing, but probably a little bit more so with creators than with athletes, because athletes, they have such a close like sponsorship relationship.
Mhm.
But it's amazing how many of them are creating content and the creator is not posting it on their own channels, which
Yeah.
is probably a function of budget. Saying like it's going to cost you X if I just make this video and hand it to you, and it costs you, you know, 50% more or twice as much if you want me to post it also on my channel. But I think there's a lot of different ways to slice that. And, you could say, look, I want to create this content as a collab with you, and we're going to post it as a collab. You're going to post it on your channel. I'm going to post it on my channel. It's just going to appear only on my channel. We're going to use like your recognizable face, or we're going to use your talent just as a creator who knows how to like work social, in which case they're essentially like a little bitty agency, right?
Yeah.
Who's like really good at producing content for a specific platform. And I think any of those things can work. And it's really interesting to see people being more diverse in how they approach that. Because for so long, it was just like, this is exactly how this relationship should basically always work. Like, you create the content, you put it on your channel, depending on what the functionalities were of the platforms at the time. Like, we do it as a collab post, or we also get a copy of the video and we post it too. There's different ways to work that depending on what year it was. But now I think there's a lot of ways to think about that.
Which is great for both sides. A creator is capable of making a lot of content, but they also don't want to jam up their feed with like sponsored post after sponsored post. And so the ability for them to actually work with brands to develop something that's of value that maybe only gets used as a meta ad could still be of a ton of value to that brand. I think it's a really, again, it comes back to that sort of educational piece where when you start these conversations with the brands, like making sure that they understand all of the different ways that you could potentially work together. Because I think a lot of people are still on this phase of like, okay, so you're sponsored, and then the deliverables are these videos that show up across everything. And it's like, well, wait, can I talk to your digital person? Can I talk to whoever runs the paid ads? Can we maybe like do a little bit of this and a little bit of that? And I think for brands, what's really great about that is that they can sort of spread the budget out across a couple different categories where, maybe they don't have to shoulder all of the stuff on the athlete marketing team, but paid could come in and chip in a quarter of the cost for that athlete. And you can find like more economical ways to actually partner with someone who is extremely capable of both delivering branded content on their channel as well as paid ads that actually give you, sort of a different outcome.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think it also brings up this idea of the brand needs to really think about who they have in house to measure all that stuff. Because what you're saying, I think, is completely right. And it's also really hard to quantify.
Yeah.
And when you were just running a bunch of Facebook ads, like that's pretty straightforward. It's not necessarily, you got to have somebody who knows what they're doing, but essentially it's like, we put in this many $1,000 and this is how many clicks. And it kind of comes out like fairly concisely in a report, right? But when you
Mhm.
start doing the things you're talking about, I mean, you can have like, well, this one was done as a collab post, and actually the reach from our collab post doesn't show up in any of our third-party measurement tools. We got to get that native. But there's other stuff we can pull from our tool, and then you've got, you could have 10, 20 different things running at any one time. And I think having people in-house who can measure it and who are really good storytellers, like
Mhm.
internal storytellers,
Yeah.
I can put this into a report, I can make some sense of it and sort of bring it around the company and be like, hey, this is how it worked, everyone. It's a little bit different than what you're used to seeing, but it's actually really effective. Like, that's hard to do, but I think if you do it well, it's such a rewarding thing to be able to see like all of these little elements that are out in the world of this bigger story.
The catch 22 for me in these conversations right now is that a lot of people in theory like the idea of all the different things that a creator could actually deliver to them, but they're afraid to spend against it in a meaningful way that would yield meaningful results. And so what you find yourself in is this loop of like, well, let's test, let's do a one-off thing. We only want you to do this one thing, and we're going to measure that, and then we're going to decide if we're going to spend any additional resources on it. And I think coming back to your point about how we measure things and we do the internal marketing, the storytelling of like, did this work, did this not work, you're kind of in a tough spot as a creator because you're like, well, this would work if you actually got the data, but you're actually not going to be able to tell a story off of one single data point. So in effect, like doing a test is not going to get a, a positive result in most cases because it's going to be the first time your audience of the creator has heard of this brand. It's going to be your first time the creator is talking about this brand. It's going to be a one-off, which like the math goes to show that you need to see a message 12 times before you do something about it. So the creator is at this massive disadvantage to try to prove themselves off of a one-off thing. And then what does that conversation look like when you go back to the brand and be like, well, I did it. That's the loop I'm stuck in right now.
No, and it's hard to have the patience or the ability to let it run for a while
Hmm.
and to buy some space, which I think is why you have to do the best possible job you can reporting internally, so you can say like, look, this is the success we are seeing. And I think, as you hear a lot of talk right now about the coming zero click internet, right? Where there's just less traffic moving around between things, as you see more walled gardens within Meta products. TikTok doesn't drive any traffic anywhere. Search is sort of getting less with AI search results and stuff. So it's going to be like, it's not going to be, I think, as easy to just be like, yes, we set up this affiliate link, drove a ton of traffic to our website, sold all this stuff. It was a win, like, I think that's going to be harder and harder over time. So you're going to have to get good at like, all right, we got a lot of traffic on this creator post over here, and this partnership over here is working really well. And, we think when this video is releasing, like we're seeing some good success in this area, and trying to tie all those things together, because if we really are moving into this like less integrated vision of the internet, then it'll be harder to measure some of those things.
That's fascinating. That's the first time I've heard of this concept of sort of zero click. Interesting to think about. Yeah, you don't have to go anywhere. You can just get it all in one place, right? And it does seem like even YouTube, there's YouTube shopping. You don't have to go to any other website. It's all contained in one place. Same thing with Instagram, same thing with TikTok. There's the TikTok shop, which overseas, they've done an amazing job with live streams and selling through the TikTok shop, and people are making obscene amounts of money in other countries as live creators who are able to sell right there on the spot. I wonder if that's why TikTok didn't really, I mean, sure, it took off. There's lots of data points in the US, but from a sales and shopping standpoint, I don't think I'd call it like the number one platform at this point. And I think a lot of it is that the creators themselves and the brands themselves didn't really figure out how to optimize it the right way.
Yeah, it's a good point. I've never quite figured out that TikTok shopping, when they started really pushing it, it was like it went from nothing to everything all at once. And then you'd open TikTok and it was like you were on the home shopping network. Like it was, and it wasn't well targeted, at least for me. I was
Yeah.
always like, what is this stuff? It's not even relevant to me. It was like, I don't know, women's jewelry or something. And I was like, why am I getting this? And maybe they just never quite got over the hump with like enough stuff to reach the right types of people.
Yeah, that could very well be it. It could be that they just, or maybe you and I just weren't using TikTok enough that it didn't have enough info to target it specifically to us. But yeah, my experience over TikTok has changed dramatically in the last couple of years. I mean, there was a time when you could just copy your Instagram or YouTube short content over there, and I used to sort of joke about it, like the three algorithms were going to duke it out to see which one got the most views. And for a while there, TikTok would absolutely crush views, and then there was like an algorithm change, and you needed to have a different style of content and a different length of content to be successful on TikTok. And then Instagram for me completely took over in terms of how many views you could get off the same piece of content. It's been interesting. It's like I feel like it's constantly changing, and you can see when people sort of give up. When they're just like, I'm not going to play this game anymore. And their views go down, and they're not willing to adapt with it, and they get frustrated, and then all their Instagram stories are about how the algorithm posed them.
Well, they're not willing, or they just don't have the capacity to adapt. I mean, I think it's hard. Like, if you're really trying to run a business as a creator, as a content creator, like that is a grind.
Hmm.
There's a lot of work. Like, which channels am I on? Am I on all the channels? Am I on all the channels every day? Like, how many versions of every piece of content do I need to make? Like, it is not an insignificant lift. I mean, running a media company is hard, and a media company, in theory, has whatever, a handful of employees to do all the different things, and then we now are sort of pivoting to all these media of one micro media companies, and it's like, yeah, you got to do all the things that this media brand does, but you got to do them all by yourself,
Yeah.
and that's
This
that's hard.
this idea of developing best practices is really challenging too, because I've got to imagine when you guys launched Free Solo, the Alex Honnold film, the best practices were easy to sort of replicate in a very easy fashion. Where now a best practice from 3 weeks ago is sort of challenging to repurpose, right?
Yeah, and I mean it was a little bit different era. So yeah, I mean the background on that was, we were working closely with Jimmy for many years at Inkwell, and so when that film went into its promotional period, like we were running social for Free Solo Film, like the actual handle, and then working with a whole variety of athletes around these content launch moments, like when the trailer came out or when it won like some of the early awards before it won the Oscar, or when it was premiering at a film festival. And um, yeah, I mean, it was just like it was an era in which I think, and it's still there. It's just that the tactics are slightly different. But we were really trying to win within like the climbing community first, and then it's like if we have climbers talking about this film and really feeling like it's an authentic, good film, which of course the film was amazing. Like we were
Hmm.
just working on some of the marketing and making sure it was reaching the right people. Then it's like then you can kind of talk to like outdoors at large, and then it can kind of sort of work its way from the inside out. And we really wanted to make sure that the core communities were fully bought in and were aware of the film, so that when whatever some Hollywood or New York Times or Hollywood reporters like, oh, what's happening with this film, they would see that there was lots of buzz and people were talking about it.
What are you seeing now? Because I think Free Solo was a great example, and you've probably worked on other projects like some of Travis Rice's films and stuff like that. The big money, like the brand really gets behind an athlete and makes this like standalone evergreen film that's going to really kind of shake beyond the circle of climbers or snowboarders or whatever into sort of a mainstream way. Free Solo certainly went mainstream, but that was a really big investment from the brands that supported Jimmy, Alex, Travis, right? What does that look like now for athletes, or more appropriately, what should it look like right now to support athletes appropriately
Mm.
from a brand standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, there's only one Free Solo, and that film is so big and was so big. It's like you could almost just take it off the table because there's just maybe those come around once in a very, very long while. What should it look like? I think is it goes back to the question that you were raising early on, is like, what are we trying to achieve with this content, and decide, is a brand film even the right tool for that? What's the goal for this year? What's the message? And there's a lot of ways to get to that message. It could be a film that's an hour long, or it could be a 15-minute mini documentary, or it could be something else entirely different. And I think that we who are doing marketing and who are building content need to come into this stuff and sort of break down all your preconceived notions and say, like, what are we really trying to achieve here? What access do we have? Like, what's our best channel? What do we have? We've got a great athlete team, like, let's start there. Or we've got this other great relationship, let's start there, and then sort of build around it, as opposed to coming in right off the bat with like, my idea is that we have to do this kind of format, this type of film, and we're going to do that first, and then we'll just figure out what to do with it when it's done.
You wrote this article on Zero Draft called Flipping the Script on Brand Film. And I feel like that's kind of congruent to this discussion where it was like, we put all this money into this film, and then the short form content, which is like 10x the results, at least from a viewership standpoint, is, like an afterthought when this style of stuff is actually performing higher than the film itself. Can you say a little bit more about kind of where you're going with that article?
Yeah, I mean, I was just, it's a thought experiment at some level of like, why do we do it that way? I mean, it's been happening for your whole career and mine, where you're meeting with somebody and they're like, I've got this film and it's pretty much done. And oftentimes, if you're sort of on the marketing team, they're like, great, now can you make sure that it gets a lot of views? And then you say, well, what's in the contract for social cutdowns? And they're like, oh, I don't know. There's like two 15-second cuts or something like that. We'll figure it out later. And that just like doesn't work.
Right.
Um, when we, I mean, Free Solo is a good example. I don't remember exactly the number, but I mean, there was like thousands of posts about that we were trying to coordinate over the course of years, or over the course of a year, and like the same when I was at Outside and helping do some social around the Warren Miller films. Like we would post like hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of like 6 months, like cut downs and excerpts and previews. And, like you have to stick with it. So I think that there is at least a conversation that you need to have of like, where is our audience really? Like, where can we get to them? And, and then figure out how you sort of approach, how do you use that tool to make the most impact and to tell the story that you want to tell. I mean, you can tell amazing stories in a series of short form. There's challenges, but like people who are really good at short form video, and it's getting a little bit longer on Instagram and TikTok, obviously, can do awesome work.
Absolutely. And you can give a second window. We talk about shoulder content, right? You've got the main piece, and then shoulder content is sort of the term that everybody uses to say, like, this is supporting content. And I suppose, I'm not sure your definition, but I feel like short form content could be a shorter YouTube, or it could be all the way into like short form content where like a short or a TikTok or an Instagram reel or whatever, right? It could be anything that's not the main film that supports the main film. But I think that instead of it just being a cut down where you, not to say that it's not credible, but it doesn't hit the same way as the full film does, but you have this window to show a different side of it, the behind the scenes stuff from that athlete's experience, or a clip that maybe they filmed on their phone while they were in whatever remote location filming it. And it's like such a great window to share that content in the context of, hey, this was what happened really while we were doing this. And I think that, yeah, you kind of lose out on all that stuff. And I think from an athlete marketing perspective, you get really caught up because a lot of times those contracts have X amount of deliverables, and then you want to save your powder for the big ones. I ran into that problem even after Red Bull, where when I was at Aura Ring, we had, of course, like big announcements or sales or whatever throughout the year, but then we'd want to do projects with the athletes. And then it was like, well, do we want them to post about the project we're doing with them, or about this Valentine's Day sale? Like, what's more important to you? And I used to, get grief from some people within the company being like, why hasn't Lindsey Vaughn posted about our new sale? And it's like, because we have X amount of posts with her, and we're doing a project with her where we release the Gucci ring, and she's going to do a podcast about it, and then we're going to release those cut downs with her. That's where the deliverables are going. We don't get like unlimited posts from Lindsey Vaughn, as an example.
Right. And is she even the right person to tell certain parts of that message? Or
Right,
is it just going
exactly.
to be like, feel super forced? Like, hi, I'm Lindsey Vaughn. Let me tell you about our Valentine's Day sale.
Right. At best, right? Or yeah, a lot of brands just expect that a repost is actually going to do anything for the athlete. And I feel like that's always some of it too, where like the goal that you're actually trying to achieve when you're working with an athlete, but something that's like a brand initiative, is how do you make that valuable to the athlete? And I feel like this is something that gets missed a lot, where it's like, no, this is like our initiative, but we just want you to share our initiative. And it's like, that's never going to work in terms of getting the results that you want. If you can tie that initiative to the athlete or creator that's talking about it, that's actually way better, and you're going to get better results. It just requires like an extra step. I was talking to a brand that I want to work with for my mountain bike channel, and I basically pitched this concept of like, hey, working together, there's like a side quest that my audience could follow throughout the entire season of us working together, because I want to tell this storyline through 10 different integrations. And instead of me just being like, here's how this product works, I could tell this much deeper, richer story that my audience is actually going to follow, to the point where we could take all of the integrations that I'm doing and make its own standalone YouTube video with all of it combined. And it would be something that they would actually watch, not just like, here's 10 videos about like how great this product is and why you should have it too. Like, there is a big difference there, but the amount of thought that goes into that is quite typically not there, right?
Well, they've hired you for your expertise, right? And your connection with your audience. But then they say, now we're going to like usurp that and tell you exactly the words to use, or how exactly we picture the product being framed. I think, like, why bother to hire you then?
It is amazing how, yeah, like all of a sudden they become the experts about how to talk to the audience that you've been building for 5, 10 years.
I used to find Inkwell, sometimes we would do like a shorter term campaign, right? Where we would get product from a brand and I'd work with the brand to identify people that were in sort of the right genre that they were looking for. They're looking for people who are into camping or, whatever, like overlanding, that kind of stuff. And, whatever it was. And then you would give them product and you would get all sorts of stuff back. And I was like, this is actually an interesting feedback loop. This is like, a group of people who are in your target audience because you're willing to work with them and they're giving you feedback about how they're using your product. Like this is really valuable. Don't blow it off and be like, oh no, we would never put our product in that kind of a situation or use it that way. I mean, if it's like a big issue, okay, but there's actually a lot giving them leeway to use your product and engage with your brand how they think it fits with themselves is actually really good feedback.
Think about how many comments there are on any given YouTube video and how that represents data points for the brand or product, and utilizing content creators in that way where it's not just about views, it's not just about clicks, but it's actually the data that you can essentially scrape from those videos of people saying like, oh, actually I use that and here's why, or like here's why I don't use it, maybe even better feedback to be able to share. And thinking about how you might lean in on athletes and creators to really get that level, that depth of data, that depth of engagement from an audience. I can't think of anywhere else you could get that level. And I don't think that people are going to go on the brand socials to give that level of feedback in most cases, or if they do, it's not going to be as gentle. I don't know.
They'll just be pissed off because nobody who's happy bothers to like make a comment on brand social.
Right. Well, and I feel like if they've got a relationship with the creator or the athlete, they probably feel safer having an honest conversation or sharing their honest opinion, where with a brand, maybe you don't care in the same way, or you approach it differently, or you're not trying to salvage the, parasocial relationship that you may have with that creator too.
If you're a brand and you're working with creators and you've got like a 10-page brief about how to talk about your brand and it's got language and all these examples and all these like can do and can't do's and it gets really long, then I think that says that your product is like too hard to use.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
because the consumer who's going to buy your product isn't going to read your 10-page thing of like how to use it. They just sort of bought the product and they're going to go out for a bike ride and use the product.
Yeah.
And at some level, like, yeah, you can direct and help steer the creators to sort of get in the right ballpark of how to use the product to make sure they don't say something stupid, but at the same time, like, see what they do with it. Can they figure
Absolutely.
out how to use it? Is the language like, if they get it and they're like, I can't even really talk about this product because I don't understand it or I don't understand why it's useful, like that that's a problem.
I do think that one of the trends that we're seeing is that brands, athletes, creators are starting to sort of figure this stuff out on a bigger scale. And I think conversations like this are hopefully helpful to brands that are trying to find their way through this process. And it's not that clear all the time, and there are questions. I don't blame any of these brands that I'm talking to about wanting to test things. I disagree with the approach, but I also understand why they're not going full force into it, because maybe it's a category that they don't understand, or they don't really see the immediate return on the investment, which is, most of these brands have been getting a really insane return off of meta ads for so long that they're stuck with that formula. And I've been in those conversations with CMOs being like, what's the formula for athletes then? This is the formula for paid ads. And you're like, yeah, that's not how it works. So I totally recognize the gap that exists there. And I think it's probably going to be a little bit before that gap closes. But are there other trends that you're kind of paying attention to? I mean, you're talking to lots of brands and athletes in this space. Are there any things that kind of stand out to you?
Well, I think, besides the creator piece, and maybe it's sort of related to it, is just this general slow, reduction of monoculture and breaking into all these smaller channels, smaller communities. And as somebody who's trying to communicate, whether you're running a media company or you're running a brand that effectively is a media company, like how do you think about that, and how do you sort of get into like which ones are you going to use? Like, should you be on Blue Sky? What's the difference? What's Threads doing now? What's happening, with the, like a Discord group or whatever. And how do you sort of balance that? There's so many places where you can play. I think that it's harder than ever right now for brands and communicators to figure out like where they want to play and how to manage all that stuff. And, like we were saying earlier, there's no clear answer. There is not a formula that you're like, well, this is it. It's just like each one is unique. And I think that's a really interesting project for anyone who's trying to sort of communicate in that space of like where are my values, where can I add value to a community, which communities really like do I fit with the best, and like which are the ones I want to experiment with this year.
The one thing that I do think is very clear is that, as an athlete, whether you're a creator in sports or you're a proper athlete, there's really no better time to at least start this process of building your platform and building sort of your community around you, whether it's using Substack to write something or YouTube. Most athletes have some form of social presence already. But one of the insights for me when I started my channel, I didn't have a running start. No one cared who I was. And that I had a cold start to build my channel up to where it was. I had to put in the reps to get there. And I think that athletes actually have a lot less headwind. They may feel like they have more people paying attention, and that might make them a little sheepish to really put themselves out there. But the upside and the long-term impact of having a platform is going to be sort of a hedge against their competitive career where they're going to have something to show for it. The whole reason why I'm so bullish when it comes to athlete content is back in the day, I was in a Red Bull meeting, and we were graduating an athlete, which means that the athlete is no longer going to be a Red Bull athlete after that meeting. And I remember, we asked like, okay, like, what's your plan moving forward? Do you have anything that we could support you kind of on the way out? And they really had no plan. And this has been somebody who was like super competitive, gold medals, everything you can think of. And everybody, myself included, was massive fan of this athlete, but just like they weren't competitive anymore. And the time had come. It was very clear to everyone, including that athlete, that like party's over. And there was nothing left. Like they were going to start from basically zero. Like, I guess I'll go back to school or something and be a physio or be a coach or whatever. And I walked out of that meeting, obviously really bummed out because this athlete was like somebody I idolized growing up. But I walked out being like, there's got to be a way for these athletes to have something to show for the career when it's over. And the answer in my mind, still to this day, is that content is the hedge against that moment ever happening again. Because if that athlete had a following of 100,000 people on YouTube or a newsletter or whatever, that conversation would have looked a lot different. Like, hey, let's transition into supporting this. Let's find ways where we can send you some places to make YouTube videos, or ways that you can write some content for us for redbull.com or whatever. Like, there would have been a completely different path for that athlete. And I think that same path exists for every other athlete that's out there, so that that moment basically never has to happen again if you can put something in place.
It's really interesting, and I think what it is pointing to maybe is that if you've built an audience on whichever channels you've decided to build your audience on or wherever works for you, the question then becomes like, what can you do with that audience for the rest of your career? And what are the other, like, you've got this group of people, it's 100,000 people or whatever it is, like, how do you build a career? Can you build a career off that? And like, what's the magic number? Who knows? Like, how many people you need to have probably depends on how interested they are in what you have to say. But it is a launching point. And I think that's what we're seeing out of athletes. And I think that's what we're seeing out of creators is it's not just about only a few people will make it purely off like winning that many races or that many events. Like that's a really small number of people. But there's like a pretty good number who are like, I can make content. I've built this audience. I can use them around. I'm launching a brand. I'm doing a collab. I've got a media company. I've got, all these other things. They're essentially little entrepreneurs, not even little, like, big successful entrepreneurs built off an audience that they built over the years.
Yeah, and they got that start as a competitor, and that's how they got the first trickle of people paying attention to what they do. But then they poured fuel on that fire to really build out something that's sustainable long term. And you're right, it could last the rest of their career and then some. I mean, I've got a YouTube channel now that I don't ever have to stop. No brand can come in and tell me, other than I guess Google directly, no brand can come in and be like, you can't do this anymore. You're not allowed to make money. Like, I can keep making YouTube videos until I'm like 100 years old, and then maybe even past that if I'm on the Brian Johnson program. Uh, but like nobody can tell me to stop. It's my platform that I've built out, and it's the audience that is sticking with me. And yeah, I think there's something really interesting and very exciting about the unlimited potential behind athlete media.
How do you value your audiences? Like, how did you pick sort of where to lean in the hardest? And do you value the people the same no matter which platform you have them on?
I think that the way that I thought about stuff in the beginning is, and still to a certain point, is about test and learn. So I've always been somebody who's like, I'll be the first one to like jump off the iceberg into the water and see what happens. So I was early on Substack, and I just was like, okay, I've been doing this newsletter. At that point, I'd been doing it just like using Klaviyo or whatever for like 18 or 19 weeks. I was like, I'm just gonna keep going and seeing what will happen. And over time, probably it gets interesting. But worst case, I'm going to have stuff to be able to share with other people that are maybe trying to start a newsletter or trying to find different ways to create content. And so, same thing with TikTok. Like, okay, I keep hearing about this platform. I'll start putting my stuff there too and see what happens. I'll test and learn what's working here. Can I apply stuff over here to what I'm doing on YouTube? And so everything has sort of been iterative. In fact, I didn't even start really honestly posting on Instagram until about a year and maybe like 18 months ago. I had under 3,000 followers on Instagram for Super Rider, and now it's at 77,000 in 16, 18 months because I started putting effort into it. And so it's on one hand sort of a signal to like anywhere you put your focus, you could be successful if you play by the rules and do it the right way. Um, how do I how do I value them is really interesting because I didn't value Instagram at first. And what happened was I wasn't getting the traction with brands that I thought I should be getting when I had a YouTube following of 50, 75, 100,000 subscribers. But when my Instagram following started ticking up into that range, I started getting more brands reaching out, more opportunities coming my way, which sort of confused me because in my mind, I'm like, hey, over here on YouTube, people are spending, anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour with me talking about bikes and about products and about all this stuff. And same thing with the newsletter. People are, opening my newsletter at like a pretty high rate and reading everything I've got and clicking on the links. Like there's a ton of value here from the data. But I also think that it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier is like finding the right partners that value what you bring to the table. And if I yeah, like I'd love to find a partner that values the thing that I have the most data for. But actually, I think it's socially acceptable to use Instagram in a work setting. And it's not socially acceptable in a lot of cases yet to be scrolling TikTok or YouTube. Maybe newsletters are a little bit different, but I feel like although YouTube has higher, longer, deeper engagement than any other platform, because Instagram is more visible in the daily life of the decision makers, it has sort of like an outsized value. And so that caused me to start putting more effort into Instagram because it's like, okay, I'm going to go the path of least resistance. Like this water is going to run downhill. I might as well go with the bucket to where it's actually collecting water versus over here, which I know is the right place to be standing. But like if no one else wants to be over there, then what good is it to be right, actually?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I mean, and I think it's okay. My sense, at least, is that you can't and don't have to be everywhere.
Yeah.
So pick the ones that like you said, there to some degree. Instagram is pretty ubiquitous right now. Everyone's paying at least some level of attention to it, and certainly within the brand outdoor sports world, like that's where a lot of action is. But at the same time, it's like do what you do well. And if that doesn't fit into the formats that Instagram offers up, like that's okay. figure out what Instagram can do for you and keep it at that, and spend your time on YouTube or podcasting or whatever else your thing is. And I think trying to force everything into one channel because that's the one channel is, I just don't think it works.
Yeah. I mean, with the podcast here, we started an Instagram account, but the amount of time that it was taking to cut down the shorts, in addition to everything else that we're doing with the newsletter, with the Slack channel, with the pods themselves, editing the YouTube for that, I just ran out of time. And I would love to have, and I think we could build a really interesting Instagram account for Second Nature, but it really just came down to like, okay, where are we getting the maximum engagement? And it's with the audio version, it's with the newsletter, and it's with the YouTube channel. And will we eventually be able to staff up and have the resources to have somebody like dedicated to cutting down shorts? Yeah, probably. And I think the channel, will become valuable and important at that stage. But like right now, we just can't keep up with all those things. And what's the most important, to your point, is the quality of conversations that we have in this podcast. Like that's number one. And everything else kind of flows from there. If we can't stay consistent with the podcast, it doesn't matter how good your Instagram clips are.
I've been doing some research into how different company types are using Instagram on a project recently. And I was looking at all these production studios, like beautiful outdoor, very successful production companies that are doing, some of the brand films that we're talking about, right? And for an awful lot of them, their Instagram is not designed to succeed on Instagram. It's like a beautiful grid that often has like still in rows of threes, like with each project. And it's like, the sort of grid where it's rows of threes and you can see what they're doing. But like that will never work on Instagram as an audience thing, because you only see like 1/3 of the picture when it gets posted, right? And they post like 1, 2, 3, so it all lines up real nice. But that's probably okay. Like that Instagram channel is there for when they have a meeting with a client and the client's like, oh, I should see what they're doing on Instagram, and they look at their grid and it looks beautiful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like, okay, that's fine, like, but they probably have a really good, Vimeo. They've got a sizzle reel on YouTube, and they've like figured out that that's what Instagram is useful for them, and totally fine.
I mean, it is, you have to go your path of least resistance, and you have to make those choices, right? That agency probably made the choice of, we're going to spend our time making our clients' social channels look good and not enough on our own. Although I feel like, how do you have a conversation about being good at social if you're not already good at social?
Yeah, I mean, most of those were more like film production companies, so it's probably less. But yeah, I mean, that is a challenge. Like you struggle with it, even when we were running Inkwell, which is a very Instagram focused thing. Like, man, keeping up our own Instagram was so hard.
Yeah, you needed an agency to manage
We needed, yeah, because then you're like, you're on other people's channels all day long, posting it. To the end of the day, you're like, oh my god.
I can only
Like,
imagine.
I cannot post again, like on my own brand and my own personal.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that must have been like. Just the behind the scenes of Inkwell, managing all those accounts and all the stuff you must have experienced during that era is.
Oh, but it's also fascinating, right? Like we had access to a lot of channels, like a lot of channels, and you could see. I wish we'd had more AI or something at the time where you could consolidate data more quickly. Like but you could see what's happening in the outdoor world, because you're looking at so many athlete channels, and you have like you know access to see data from 100 athletes across the space. You're like, oh, that's interesting. Like this type of content's really working, or this is what's trending in this space. It's a really powerful view into the sort of outdoor industry
Yeah.
through athlete channels.
We could do another hour, I think, of this discussion. There's got to be a part two, because like we said at the outset, we could nerd out about this stuff for literally hours, and I love this level of depth, because I think there's a lot for people that are content creators or potentially athletes to take from it. I think there's a lot for brands to take from this stuff, and I think the insight that we've both kind of collectively had straddling both of those is sort of a rare thing. What you did at Inkwell still, I mean, I think stands out in terms of best practices and how you've accomplished what you've done. And I think the biggest takeaway for me too is like, when we're having these conversations, it really is about like, what is it that you're actually trying to accomplish? What is the goal? And then let's go from there and to figure out how we get there, as opposed to like, what are the different levers we want to pull? Like, let's first decide what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a good way to frame it. And what are we trying to accomplish? And then also like, what do we have access to?
Yeah.
You're like really taking a hard look. Like, we have this huge email list that we actually basically don't use because it's not sexy. Or, like how do we, what we've got these athletes that we just don't work with well enough, like what's at hand rather than being like we have to build something. It's really hard to build from the ground up. That's a long-term commitment. So what's the goal? Like what do we need to get done and be really clear about what can achieve that? And then like what tools do you have that you can get at most quickly?
Amazing. This is such a fun
Yeah, it was
conversation.
great.
Let's wrap it up with a BPC, brand product content. You're the guest, so I'm gonna let you go
Yeah, I'll
first.
go first. So I'm gonna go like stick with our media nerd theme, and I've got this great book that if you're watching on, I think you can see it. It's Invisible Rulers is the name, and Renee DiResta is the author. It's kind of long. It's a little bit academic, but she's super super interesting. So it's about essentially how she started working in misinformation and disinformation and how those campaigns worked and how they sort of like moved from like into these communities and then the people, the roles of the different people within the communities that amplified misinformation. And then she went on to lead the Stanford Internet Observatory,
Oh
which was
wow,
doing like misinformation. They were working with all the social platforms on the disinformation campaigns, which eventually became like their work eventually became the Twitter files. And she got pulled in front of Congress to testify and they shut down the Internet Observatory. But it's like, it's a really long, super interesting deep dive into kind of how information flows through communities that's like interesting in and of itself and timely, but also really relevant for the kind of discussion we have.
that's so cool. Did you ever read that book, Everybody Lies? It's somewhat related of like how people on the internet are just,
All
you know,
lying.
what you see versus what's actually happening, and I think it was somewhat related. Everybody Lies came out, I think, a little bit earlier than that book, but it was, I think the cover has like a elephant, but it has zebra stripes on it or something like that. And it was just like what you see is not what's actually happening on the internet, which I think is even more poignant now in the age of AI, where who knows what's real at this stage, you
Yeah,
know?
totally.
I gave a talk at my daughter's school, like her, at the time it was her third grade class, and they actually asked me to come in and I thought they were going to have me talk about marketing, and then like the day before, like, oh, actually, we want you to talk about misinformation, and I was like, I'm sorry, what? Slight difference between the two, and so I pivoted to this like talk on AI and how to like spot things that were deep faked, and I used this tool where because her class is like a Chinese immersion school, I made it where I was speaking Chinese for the first little bit, and the kids were like, wait, what? And seeing this group of, at the time, third graders interacting with deep fakes and AI images, where I did like a, is this real? Is this real? And trying to help them understand. But now it's getting so crazy that you can't even really tell. There was a great Patrick Mahomes post game interview that went viral that was definitely deep faked, but you can't tell. And that's terrifying in this era.
It is, and I have kids too. They're a little bit older than yours, but I'm much more worried about my parents than I am about my kids with that. Like
Yeah.
the kids, mine are in high school and the beginning of college, and they're like very savvy as to how social works, as to what information is reliable, not information, it isn't reliable. Like it's sort of been drilled into them their whole lives. So yeah, I mean, they obviously have the same challenges that all of us have, but also I think they're just hyper aware of it.
I wonder if this sort of ties into the conversation we've just been having about why athlete and creator social and content is so valuable, and that we've built up all this trust over a long period of time, and you can trust a person that you've been following for years versus maybe an outlet that is publishing who knows what.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but also part of what Renee DiResta is talking about is, a lot of the first part of her whole thing is medical, like anti-vaccination stuff, and she was living in California, like essentially looking into that stuff because her kids were in elementary school at the time or whatever, and it's like the idea of audience capture where somebody starts out posting about whatever, like just being a mom, and then they realize they're starting to make some money whenever they mention like skepticism of health claims, and all of a sudden
Mm.
it's like they become a full-on anti-vax poster
Whoa.
because they've just been like, oh my god, there's like, I can get everybody riled up and get good reach, and you just sort of get sucked into that. You just go further and further, and each week you have to go a little bit further than last week.
Mm.
I think that's also the threat that everyone who's being a creator has to be aware of, is like not get pulled into that, because the algorithm is going to, and crowds will try to push you that way if you're not careful.
Yeah, that's a good call out for sure. Did you say that you had a second
Oh,
BPC?
yeah. The other one, besides content, a brand, I think this, we're recording this the week after the Super Bowl. I don't know what will happen, but just the other day, the Duolingo owl was killed on the internet, and it's just been this fascinating, like, first of all, like this weird social media mascot for Duolingo and the ties to Dua Lipa and all this stuff. And now the owl is maybe dead, and they had a whole funeral thing. And it's amazing the amount of the coverage. Like every major media company was on the homepage of CNN yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
like discussing your brand's mascot that just got killed off. And it's kind of meaningless. Like who knows where it really goes, but pretty fascinating that social played just right can something like as meaningless as that can get pulled into this like major discussion as if it's actual news. I like, hats off to them for winning on that one.
It's so fascinating, right? Like, I want to know the conversations that even in the early days, because Duolingo has been a big deal. The owl mascot on TikTok was a huge thing for a long time, and what they've been doing with social strategy, it's sort of been this unhinged, following in the footsteps of, if you remember, like the Wendy's Twitter account back in the day was super unhinged, and people were like, "Wait, is this the real Wendy's?" And there's a history of brands doing this, and going back to the purpose behind all of it and the result, what are they actually chasing after? Are they just chasing after brand recognition, brand recall? Are they trying to get people to go download and use Duolingo? Is hearing about Duolingo, the owl every day, motivating lots of people to like, oh, that's right, I didn't do my Spanish yet today? I'd be really curious what kind of data they have on the back end to back up why this path makes sense, or are they just so far down that path that they can't stop now? I don't know the answer to this question, but I do know that, like at Red Bull, one of the areas that Red Bull is well known for is the social media strategy. And what you might not know is that in the early days of the social media strategy, there weren't any rules because social media was new. And everywhere else within Red Bull, there are some very hard and fast rules. Like the way that you do branding at an event is very specific. This is how the Bull and Sun shows up. This is how it can be placed. This is if there's too much or not enough branding in this location. They get really specific. Same thing with athletes. Same thing with every element of the Red Bull brand is extremely specific when it comes to guidelines. Except at that point, there wasn't a guideline for social media. And so that team that was newly formed went everywhere they could possibly go and scratched out a lot of first mover advantage because there were no rules. And so they had a chance to like do their creative stuff. And then it turned into a strategy later down the line. So I sort of wonder if maybe Duolingo is the same way, where it's like they kind of got out in front of it on the TikTok trends and stuff like that, and then it just took on a life of its own. But are they now asking questions? And maybe there's a bigger story with the owl getting killed off, or maybe somebody got in there and was like, guys, this is taking a lot of resources and it's not really actually doing anything other than just being a meme. Do we need this? I'd be really curious to know the inner workings of that discussion.
Well, we'll find out. As of the recording of this, the owl is still dead. And I certainly wouldn't recommend to anybody that I'm working with to try it, because the chances of pulling it off and turning into that are very slim. Like you got to have the right person in house to run that. Like everything has to fall your way for that to be cool and fun,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
they pulled it off, but not many can.
There are a lot of examples of it not working out and just being super cringy for a
Yes,
lot of other brands. So yeah, you had to like full on commitment and probably a little bit of luck in there too. It's
a
not
lot of
all
luck.
it's not all just execution. Okay, well, I'm excited to see where that one goes. My BPC I actually got from Christian Rawls, who runs the Core podcast. we recorded a podcast together yesterday, and he shared this link with me. So I'm a huge Ryan Holiday fan. I love The Daily Stoic, Obstacles Away, all those books. I did not know that he has a research assistant by the name of Billy Oppenheimer. And Billy puts out a weekly newsletter called 6 at 6 on Sunday. I'm going to put the link to this guy's channel in here, but this is the guy that's helping Ryan Holiday come up with his insights and his stories that he shares. And basically, Billy Oppenheimer shares 6 different kind of like mini stories that fit into an overall narrative, and I'm obsessed with it. And this is like, it's up there. Zero Draft was an instant subscribe. Billy Oppenheimer also instant subscribe. I think a lot of people are really going to like this one because it sort of has a similar theme to a lot of the stuff that Ryan writes, but just this guy's got a really cool story. He found out about Ryan Holiday from the book Perennial Seller, which is like a very popular book with a lot of athletes that are trying to kind of figure out their whole thing, and ended up like reaching out to him after reading every other book that Ryan had read and just being like, "Hey, thanks." Ended up at an event with Ryan, asked him if he could help him, like literally any job, and now he works in the office with him. So, really cool story that's also on his website. But this weekly newsletter is really, really good. So,
Amazing. I'm going to sign up right away. I want to see that.
yeah, it's good. Well, Patrick, thank you. There has to be a part two of this because like I said, we could probably talk for another a couple hours on exactly this topic, and there's a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about that we didn't even get to. But I really enjoyed having you on. This has been a pod I've been waiting to have for a while. So thanks so much for the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great conversation. We'll do it again.